All right, hi there. Welcome to MS201, Lesson 21, the Introduction to Terrain Models. My name is Captain Silver Beatty. I'm an APMS with the University of Montana Grizzly Battalion, and I'm going to be going through this lesson with you today. Now, just keep in mind, this is very much an introduction to terrain models. It's kind of a foundational building block into something that you're going to go into more detail with in the spring semester of your MS2 year, where you talk a little bit more about sand tables, terrain models, and rehearsals, and how they all play together. This is just very much an introduction, very basic, not a lot of information. You'll get more in-depth training on all of this next semester. But before we even start, go ahead and scan that QR code if you'd like to, right there on your title slide. That's going to take you to a more updated version, or the most updated version of this slide deck. It's a website version of it that is also going to have embedded links, plus the embedded video that I'm going to play for you during this time with me. And if anything, I'm recording this right now in October of 2024. Depending on when you're watching this video, things may have changed. There may have been some updates to this class. Maybe I'm not even in ROTC anymore and there's been some changes, but I will make sure that that QR code is linked to the most updated version of the lesson before I leave ROTC. All right, and if anything, it might be a good idea to have a piece of paper, pencil, pen up, or at least a Word doc open on the side so you can jot some notes in there as we go through. It's not a ton of information for you today, but we are going to talk about a few specific things that you'll want to keep in mind in case you're ever pinged as the TMK guy or gal. And that's the person that's going to throw together the terrain model out there on lab days or at FTX. So pay attention with me, get some coffee, get some caffeine in you, stick with me for the next little bit, and we'll go through some terrain models here. So if you did happen to scan that QR code, you are going to have access to the links that are right here on this deck, this slide deck. First, there's the Introduction to Terrain Models read ahead. That's going to go into a little bit more detail about rehearsals, sand tables, all that fun stuff. I wouldn't get too in-depth with that right now, but something that might help if you want to just get that extra little information before next semester is I do have a YouTube screencast link on here to the actual terrain model and sand table rehearsal class for the MS202 curriculum. So you could certainly click on that or just find it here if you're on YouTube. Just find it in my playlist. MS202 is going to have that. And then we are going to have this terrain model video, the actual construction of it, but you're going to watch it during this lesson as well. Just happens to be linked in case you want to go back and look at it another time. Let's just jump right into this. So you're going to have some think about it questions, as I always ask. Take the time, pause the video, read through the questions, and actually do some self-reflection. Because the more that you're engaging with these questions with your brain, the more likely you're going to be able to retain the information that I'm talking through throughout this entire lesson. So with these think about it, if you see it, pause it, read through it, and come up with some of your own answers. So to start with, I want you to think about, have you ever driven a long distance, but you forgot to pre-program the GPS and maybe needed some kind of service like fuel, medical services, food, spare cash like from an ATM, or even an auto mechanic? And with that, why do you think it might be important to actually plan your driving or your walking route prior to departing on a longer journey? And if you've had an issue with that in the past, how might your situation have turned out differently if you had pre-programmed the GPS with different points of interest like gas stations, restaurants, ATMs, or even rest areas? Now, before you pause this, think about your own answer. I'll give you a little example for me. I'm out here in Montana, right? Middle of nowhere, you can go hours with no cell service. And I've had my own example of having to drive from one town to another. I was driving my husband's truck. One of his tires had a leak in it, didn't realize it until I was next to a river lake area that had no shoulder to pull over on. I had no cell service. It's raining, it's getting dark, and I didn't even know where to go to get help. I eventually was able to get some help. Pulled into a little section off the road that had about 1/2 bar of service, was able to call my in-laws, had to wait a couple hours for them to get there and get everything fixed and get a tire guy out there. But it was a mess. And if I had pre-programmed or understood where I could stop for help sooner or put that into my Google Maps, it would have pulled up even when I didn't have service. would have been easier for me to get there and get stuff fixed a lot sooner. So that's what we're talking about, is if you're in an area where your GPS goes down, your Google Maps isn't working, why would it be important to plan ahead and have all these stops pre-programmed into your plan? And I think that, kind of a right answer, or where I want you to go with this, is it just makes that journey a lot easier. That you already have pre-programmed stops along the way. You know where your rest areas are. You know where you need to stop for things, right? So now translate that a little bit into how labs or sticks lanes work, and you'll see where I'm going with this. So by the end of this quick lesson, I want you to be able to understand the very basics of assembling a terrain model. I want you to understand how to create a field expedient terrain model and what that entails. And then going from being able to create a field expedient terrain model kit to then understanding how to construct a full-on field expedient terrain model. So there's a difference between creating the kit and understanding how to create the terrain model out of that kit on the backside. And we'll talk through all these in a little bit more detail. So another think about it here. How are the points of interest in a GPS like the items that you might have in your terrain model kit? Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, terrain model kit is kind of, most of your, upperclassmen probably have one where it's got all these little symbols and cutouts that show where the ORP is, where your assault team is going to be, where your support team, weapons squad, where the team leader might be. So it's kind of those cutouts that symbolize where things are going to be. Now with that, you can think of your points of interest the same way that you think of like your alpha being out on your terrain model, your ORPs, your objectives, maybe your phase lines if you add things like that in there. So those are what we consider your points of interest on the military side from that kind of language thought. So with that then, why would it be important for leaders to know how to actually build terrain model kits and then construct a terrain model? Well, that's pretty obvious, right? We want them to be able to show us where we're going and use the correct things to facilitate that so that everybody understands what's going on. You need that visual representation of that area of operation, or the AO, for your mission brief, or where your op board brief is going to be. And it's going to make it a lot easier to understand the actual geographic location and your points of interest, in addition to where the unit locations and movement are going to be. So when we're talking terrain models, this is this idea of a 3D concept of the geographic area that you're going to be working in. So it's obviously very important for leaders to be able to know how to build their kits and then construct the terrain model so that they can easily give their audience a visual representation of what's about to happen. So then what do you think you would need in order to build an effective terrain model? Now, I'm not talking items. I'm talking about maybe even some intangible things that you need. Skills, tools, and time. You need the skills to be able to put it together, and that comes with just the knowledge of what's supposed to be on your terrain model. You need the tools to do it, and sometimes that's just our hands and our boots. And then you need the time. Now that comes as part of your troop leading procedures, right, where we build time into our planning and our execution phases. We make sure that we reserve enough time to build an effective terrain model and then do rehearsals from that terrain model. So you don't need people, you don't need resources, you don't even need space, because you can build an effective terrain model in a small space, right? All you need are the skills, the right tools, and enough time to build it. All right, so let's talk about our different types of terrain model kits, or TMKs. We have both prefabbed and field expedient. And I want you to think about this as essentially the prefabbed come from Amazon, the field expedient use the Amazon box, okay? So your prefabbed can be purchased either locally in a store. You can get them on Amazon, you can get them on Etsy, you can get them in all kinds of different places. Just beware if you get them from like an army surplus store, some of the pieces and parts might be a little dated. And depending on the manufacturer or the date that it was actually made, some of your items might be different, because the World War II items are going to differ from the Gulf War, just because the location, the age of the items, the equipment that was used, those are all going to be dependent on the area, the type of war, the time period that it was built in. So just be cautious if you get some from Army surplus stores. There's several inexpensive versions that you can get on Amazon. You can even build your own. I know mine has some G.I. Joes in it because I still have one from when I was in ROTC and I've kept it around. It's got all kinds of different yarns. I've kind of just thrown it together myself, but it does look pre-fabricated because I did start with a base one and just added additional things over time. Now you also have the field-expedient. Like I said, this is built from the Amazon box that you might receive a prefabbed one in. And this is assembled by an individual. And really, it's going to be just find what you can and make it work. The field-expedient is going to consist of just on-hand materials that you can find within your location. So maybe some rocks, twigs, maybe there's stuff that's provided by your unit supply, so some boxes or tape, maybe some engineer tape. There's all kinds of ways that you can build it, but it's just kind of thrown together with what you can. So maybe think of like the recycling bin, different stuff that you can use. You get to be a little bit more creative with a field-expedient kit. You would really use this, maybe your prefabbed one is not big enough for what you need, or you just don't have it with you and nobody else has one. In all honesty, neither one is better than the other. And in fact, people that use prefabricated ones might get really caught up in making it look perfect when really it just needs to be understood by the most junior soldier that's receiving the brief. So you can make a perfectly great terrain model out of boxes, tape, and engineer tape. I promise. So those are your differences between a prefab terrain model kit and a field-expedient TMK. So how do we construct a terrain model? Well, we're going to have a nice little cadet here walk us through the steps over the next 3 minutes. I just want you to keep track of those steps as they're coming. Maybe write them down and see which order and how he ensures that he's got a good, solid terrain model going.
Alright, what's going on, guys? I'm out here to show you guys how to put all the pieces together. Right here, I have my terrain model kit. Now I'm going to take all the pieces and show you guys how to assemble the terrain model kit.
First things first, you want to look at the map and do a map recon. You want to look at the area of operations that you guys are going to be in, look at the grid, and kind of look at what kind of terrain you have. Here I can see I have hills, I have a lake, and I have dense vegetation. So when I start my TMK, I always start with the grid lines. That way I kind of have a canvas to begin making the terrain model. All right, so you got some 550 cord, take your rope, cut it. What we're going to do is we're going to gut the inside, this white stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to pull this white stuff out. So you got the 550. All right, next we're going to build the grid points. So on our map, we're going to do a 2x2. All right, here I have some sticks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dig them to the ground. All right, as you can see, I use the sticks as the corners of the grid. If the sticks aren't sticks to the ground, I use a knife to cut the sticks so it's a little bit sharper and you can shove them to the ground easier. Next, I'm using the guts of the 550 cord as grid lines. I'm tying them around each stick. I'm not using any fancy knots. I'm just tying it just enough so it doesn't fall or fly away. Pretty simple and straightforward here. It doesn't have to be perfect squares, but you want to get as close to perfect as possible. Next, you're going to build the blow up. So this is going to be basically just one square, really big. We'll go into more detail on this later. Next, you want to develop the terrain using a shovel or your hands. So I'm using an entrenchment tool here to build the hills and kind of shape the terrain so it matches the map. Right here, you can see that I just built like a saddle, built on the hilltop. As you see right here, there's a hill here, hilltop here, here, and then here's a kind of a saddle looking thing. Next, what you want to do is add some color to this place. I'm using the blue for water. Here you can see there's a lake, and over here there's going to be like a river. Next, I'm going to use black for man-made objects. So here, there's going to be a road, and then there's going to be another road pointing out the other way. If you have time, you can also label this road and label the lake and river. Next, I'm using green leaves as vegetation. So I know it's going to be dense vegetation over here because I looked at the map. So I'm adding all these leaves to represent how dense the vegetation is going to be. Step second, what you want to do is add your TMK pieces. Kind of place them where you're going to be during the operation. So you can see the enemy's going to be there. You're going to see the assembly area over here. Step 8, you come to the center, but I'm So I'm going to label the coordinates in accordance to the map. Over here, 0, 1, 0, 2, and next is 0, 3. And you also want to label the vertical axes as well. Step 9, you want to write as much detail as you can on the TMK pieces. So on the primary route, I'm adding the distance, direction. On the assembly area, I'm adding the grid coordinates. On the objective, I'm labeling the name. On the ORP, I'm going to write the grid location. You want to add as much detail as possible so that everyone can understand what's going on.
All right, so that's kind of the base, quick, down and dirty in 3 minutes of how to build a terrain model, right? That 3D visualization of your area of operations. So now, in case you couldn't hear it very well or it wasn't coming through very clearly, I do have all of these steps written right here with an example of a terrain model here off to the side. So again, get that map recon done. Build the corners of your grid, so each corner, so you can build off of it and make sure that you have a good scaled version. Then you're going to establish those grid lines, making sure that they're as squared off as possible. You're going to repeat those same steps for an inset or a blow up, or some people call it a macro model, which is really just a bigger blown up version, usually of your actions on. Anything that needs a lot more detail that people need to see piece by piece of. Step 5, you're going to develop that terrain to kind of match your map. So you're going to have your hills, you're going to have your vegetation. Make sure that whatever your map shows is what you've got on your terrain model here. Then you can add some of those additional details if you have time. Label them with some additional stuff like the grid coordinates, the distance, direction, your azimuths, things like that. And then of course use your common sense colors for roads, water, vegetation. You know, don't use blue to show vegetation, don't use green to show water. Make it make sense. Then you can add your actual TMK pieces. So if you have a prefab, this is going to be some of those printed off, pretty different shapes of red triangles and blue circles that signify and symbolize different positions or parts of your unit. And if you don't have those, then you just take pieces of paper, cut them down or rip them out and mark what you need to mark. Again, as long as it makes sense to the most junior person standing there receiving the brief, you're going to be fine. Then it's good enough. Then he labeled his grid coordinates a little bit late. I would actually move this step up here when you're establishing those grid lines. Just label them while you're up there. And then, like you said, write down those additional details if you can of your azimuth, distance, grid location. You can have different grid locations for different portions of it if you have time. So that is the quick version of how to build this TMK. I encourage you to volunteer yourself the next time you get a chance to go out and help your MS3, maybe on a 6 lane or out at FTX during lab. Ask if you can help build a TMK. Call it arts and crafts time. That's what I call it with my cadets. Let's do some arts and crafts time and see how creative we can get with this. All right, so now that you have kind of the steps and all that information from the terrain model construction video, I want you to take 5 minutes to pause this video and either type out or write out a list of items that could be used to create a field-expedient terrain model kit. Now remember, field-expedient means that it's something you can just find on hand. So think about where you're located. What does your climate and geography look like? Are you in Montana where it's easy to find rocks and brush and twigs, or are you down somewhere near a beach where there's not a lot of mountainous terrain or trees to pick from? So think of what you could have on hand into a field-expedient terrain model kit, what you would have if you had, 9 to 30 people around you, and then record that list, get as creative as you can. Truly, I've even had people write dog tags and earrings or rubber bands from women's hair. They've had all kinds of stuff on this list. So again, take some time, pause this, record your list, and then come on back, and we're going to use it as a comparison to what the Army wants you to think about for a field expedient. All right, so hopefully you were able to come up with a pretty comprehensive list of things. We'll go through these, see if you thought of the same things, or maybe you didn't. You could add this to your little quote-unquote toolbox of additional stuff to pick up another time. But we'll go through these real quick. You can use some small pieces of cardboard or just paper to identify your TRPs, your target reference points, and even indirect fire targets. Just want to make sure that you actually show the grids for those points. You could construct your breach, support by fire, and even your assault positions using those same methods. And then just use colored yarn or string for that easy identification. You could build bunkers and other buildings using MRE boxes, maybe tongue depressors from your medic, or even sticks out on the ground. You could construct perimeter wire, also known as C-wire, using the wire spiral of a notebook. You could show key phase lines with different colored string or yarn. You could even use colored tape or yarn to replicate things like trench lines. You can dig it in and then color it, maybe with some colored chalk or even spray paint if your unit has some on hand. You always need to have a north-seeking arrow, so make sure that you have that, and you could use sharpened twigs, pencils, or even colored yarn to show that as well. Maybe use some red yarn, 5.56 millimeter rounds, or some toy rangers, poker chips. Use any of those to designate either enemy or even friendly positions as well. So that's a very small list of ideas. Again, it's whatever you have on hand that you can grab, and this is the time to go back and have workshop time, as my kindergartner calls it, where you can just build something with whatever you got, right? So get creative, have fun with it. So here's part 2 of your practical exercise. Now don't let this get too confusing. You do want to scan that code right there. It's going to take you to the instructions and kind of the model of what you're working off of. So with that, after you scan that QR code, you're going to be able to get to this handout. First, I want you to study the terrain model that's on that Word document. You're going to want to decide what you think each item, 1 through 20, is on the diagram. So you've got to find 20 different things on this terrain model and figure out what you think they are. Then you need to come up with maybe some field expedient items that you could use to depict those items on a 3D model terrain model in the field. So let me pull it up and show you what I'm talking about here. All right, so if you were to scan that code, this is what's going to pull up for you. Right here, this construct a field model, terrain model, field expedient, practical exercise. So when I'm talking about that diagram below, this is the diagram I'm talking about. You're going to find 20 things on here that should probably be on your terrain model, and then label what you think they are. So for instance, you're going to come down here and have the diagram display items, and then what you could use from your field expedient kit, right? So we have building 1, building 2, building 3. Maybe you want to put parking lot on there. You've got some target reference points here of Alpha Bravo 0001, Alpha Bravo 0002 with the grid coordinates next to them. You've got your north-seeking arrow, your limit of advance blue, phase line white, phase line red. So I've given you about half of them. Now I want you to just take a pause, take a look at that diagram from your QR code, or I'll even keep it right here for a moment. Pause right here, find 20 things that should be labeled, and then think of 20 items that you could use to label those different portions of the diagram. Go ahead and pause here and continue working through. All right, so I hope you were able to work through that. I hope you came up with some good field expedient items that you could throw on. And I hope you feel comfortable finding those things, going out and actually recreating that exact diagram, but in a 3D version. That's the end of that practical exercise. Let's talk about what you need to have on your terrain model. So we know what we should have in our kit, but what do we always have to show on our 3D model? Well, number 1, your north-seeking arrow. And that should be oriented to the actual north of wherever you are. And this way, when your folks that you're briefing are looking at your terrain model, they're already oriented and looking north or wherever movement, whatever movement you're making, they can orient themselves and actually look up and see which direction they're going to be going. And it's right in front of them as well, if that makes sense. So you always want to have that north-seeking arrow and then orient it to be actually pointing north in real life as well. You should have a scale of some sort on there so that people understand what the distances are and make sure that the scale makes sense for the distances. And that's going to come with making sure that you have grid lines, of course. You should be able to show where your objective location is. And then, of course, any exaggerated terrain relief or water obstacles. You should have your friendly patrol location. So you should have your friendly forces on there. And then you should move them through as you're going through your execution paragraph of your op order, of course. Any kind of targets that are on there, especially for your like target reference points, right? You should also include the grid and the type of round that's kind of referenced for that, for whatever is designated for that TRP. But make sure for sure you have your grid coordinate on there. And that's so that anybody, they should be writing those down, and anybody that's going to call in that support needs to know the grid location. You should definitely have your routes, especially your primary, but don't forget to mark an alternate route as well, because things never quite go to plan. And speaking of plans, make sure that you've got your release points pushed on there. So your objective rally point, maybe a link up release point, and then other release points as necessary. Your danger areas should be marked very clearly, whether that's roads, trails, open areas, any kind of linear danger area that you might be crossing. You should have a legend that tells whoever's looking at it what all of these little insignias or items actually mean. And then of course you should have your inset model if you have time, which you really should put a lot of time into, and that should be a large scale model of your objective. And that's where you really want to put a lot of detail because, well, that's the main part of your mission, right? So if you're doing an attack, you should have a blow up version of just the actions on and be able to work through that so that your MS3 or your briefer, whoever is giving the execution portion of the brief, can actually pick up and move pieces so that every single person receiving that brief actually understands their role in everything. So this is, again, everything that you should have on your terrain model. Of course, you can always add additional things as well. Phase lines, your LOAs, additional points that might be important, distances, directions, everything should be on there, but this is primarily what you need to make sure you have and make sure it makes sense. All right, whew. That was a pretty quick down and dirty class. Again, take a look at that YouTube, scroll through some of my videos, you get a little bit more information about sand tables and rehearsals and how these terrain models play into the rehearsal types. But hopefully by now you understand the basics of assembling a terrain model kit and what it looks like to have a prefabbed one, what you should look out for, versus a field expedient version, one that you can build yourself. Hopefully now you feel more confident in being able to go out and create a field expedient terrain model kit. And then we've really focused in on this last half of how to construct that field expedient terrain model. So hopefully you'll be able to go out there, and like I said, I encourage you to go out and volunteer yourself to be the TMK person the next chance you get. Because all that's going to do, if you listen to any of my lessons, all that's going to do is build your confidence. The more practice and reps you get in real life scenarios, during lab, during FTX, during class, is going to help you every time just become better and better and better, so that when you're in MS3 and you're being evaluated on this in ROTC, you feel more confident, and then even beyond that into your career, you'll be a little bit more confident going into other training exercises or real life war scenarios where you'll be building these kits. So if you have any questions, find your primary advisor, your primary instructor, maybe a high-speed MS3, MS4, get some arts and crafts time in together. If all else fails and you can't get the answers that you need, feel free to try to reach out to me. Depending on when you're watching this, I may or may not still be part of ROTC, but you're welcome to try. My email is silver.beatty, that's Bravo Echo Alpha Tango Yankee, @mso.umt.edu. I appreciate you sticking with me through this one. Hope you gained a little bit more information. You feel a little bit better about terrain models and sand tables in general. And I will see you on the next video.